So welcome so much. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for literacy and multilingual learners. I am Kaylin Wallatin, and I am a multilingual consultant at Wayne Risa. You continue to have the links there to get to the slide deck. And I have been with Risa now. I have just starting on my seventh year, and I have been in education for just over 30 years, always in either bilingual or ELD, English language development education. So, whole career working with multilingual learners and their families. I always show this framework in almost everything I present, and that is because all of our work fits into those three areas you see at the top, and often in more than one, right? So English language development is an essential area, meaningful access to curriculum or core content, and everything is only possible because of having a welcoming assets-based environment towards our students and their families. Our focus today, because it's on literacy, is on meaningful access to core content and literacy in really all the content areas. But yes, the main focus is going to be on reading and what that looks like for multilingual learners. So I want to start first with looking at literacy development and how that can differ between monolingual English learners and multilingual learners. By the way, this is coming from a document that is on the resource Padlet that you have access to at the end of the slide deck. What I really want on this slide to focus on is that multilingual learners need to be able to use their full linguistic repertoire. What that means is that as you're acquiring another language, no matter how many languages you have acquired previously, you are making meaning like throughout and within and across all of your languages, right? If you look at this, too, I think you'll notice on this chart that while having more than one language ultimately helps you cognitively, so these students are actually going to have a cognitive advantage for having a minimum of two languages residing and working daily in their brains. You can see that unfortunately that this can be stigmatized as they're acquiring English, right? Often their home languages, as you see there, are more marginalized and undervalued in the community, in the school community. And that we are always giving the message, or almost always, whether we intend to or not, that English has a better status. Like all the important work gets done in English. Like as you get better, everything you do is going to be done in English. So that is something that we're going to talk about ways to avoid as well. But again, it's a cognitive advantage, and we also want to make it socially valued and valued in our communities as well. Here are some more differences that affect their literacy development. So I want to look here at that first box for multilingual learners. Uh, those who might be learning to read in a language that they are still simultaneously learning to speak and understand. Because if we look at like monolingual English speakers, if we say the first 5 or 6 years of their life, they may or may not have had preschool or other things to support them with emergent literacy, but they really have been developing their oral language in English, right? A good 4, 5, or 6 years before any of that really starts to happen. If we do have younger children coming into our schools in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and they are acquiring English, they are often learning to read in English at the same time. So it obviously can happen simultaneously. It does not have to be, sequential, but that is something that can look like a disadvantage initially because you have other students who come in with so much more oral language and English built up. If you have students who come in, generally speaking, grade second and higher, can depend, of course, though. And if they are already literate in their home language or languages, then you're going to find that they already know how to make meaning through text, right? So they actually have an advantage. They need to understand what, English phonics looks like, what the English orthographical system looks like. And they need, of course, to know more English vocabulary. But once they start to have those components, they will really accelerate rapidly because you're not teaching them how to make meaning with text. When you're teaching someone, no matter what age, what it looks like to make meaning from text is a whole it's a whole different area, right? Or arena. Again, it can be done, and I've done it, and so many of my colleagues have as well, and you probably in the audience have as well. Uh, but it's just going to look different, right? And we're going to have some different concerns. So this is not complete. Again, this is on the resource palette, but the Reading League Summit had a joint statement, and I'm going to show you some of the signatories from the multilingual world as well, because a lot has come up with the science of reading and its implementation for multilingual learners, right? Who are also maybe referred to as English learners and emergent bilinguals, hence the different language here from this document. This is a longer document. I have chosen some points that really, really resonated with me there. So when we look there at that first one, foundational skills, um, of course, multilingual learners need to understand foundational skills and acquire them in English, right? No one is saying they don't need to. In fact, the science of reading themselves, if you go on to more reputed websites, and looking at more research is saying that foundational skills is part of what we do. It is not what science of reading is not, is just drill and skill and in that. But we just have to be careful looking at the implementation because sometimes that's what it turns into, right? Like with anything, implementation is key. So I would even say my little bias showing here when I used to talk about balanced literacy. Word work and foundational skills were always a part of that. They never were not. But unfortunately, perhaps in some places, that area was less realized, right? And hence some of the political movements that are coming behind this and contributing to things like the science of reading. So anyway, just shouting out foundational skills are important, but they are not the be all end all, right? Um, a huge thing that happens or is really needed for multilingual learners is that emphasis on oral language development, and we'll see that today throughout this hour. There is a huge emphasis on that for monolingual English speakers in grades K to 2, but after that it starts to taper off. And I would argue that there are probably some monolingual English speakers who could use a lot more of that oral language development as well. Just learning, how we speak in school settings and in different disciplines, right, can become all part of that and can also affect what you're doing when you're reading and writing. This one, of course, you've probably picked up from my talking earlier. But a student's home language is an asset. It has intrinsic value, and we need to value it because of that. But if you're speaking to people who might not be into the intrinsic value so much, it is also something that can be used to leverage second language acquisition and literacy development. So if we're paying attention to that home language, we can actually, have them become readers and writers more quickly. Um, WIDA and so many other places talk about the need to integrate language and content knowledge, and that includes the areas of literacy, right? Includes reading and writing. And then finally, the materials that you use should be culturally and linguistically responsive, and we'll take a look about what that could look like in just a moment. So these are just a few of the signatories. There are a ton of signatories on that joint statement from the Reading Summit. The Reading League is the big sponsor of it all, but the others are just a few different organizations that are well known nationally. WIDA in Michigan is a WIDA state, the Center for Applied Linguistics, the National Committee for Effective Literacy, that you'll see I've taken some things from that focus on literacy and multilingual learners and research around that, and NIALPA, the National Association of English Learner Program Administrators. So just taking you back a little bit, so Tunmer was working with somebody else. Let me see if I've got it here. Yeah, with Gao. And the old kind of simple view of reading was basically if we take decoding and we multiply that with listening comprehension, we're going to get reading comprehension. So this was kind of redone a little bit a few years ago, right? And that idea of decoding became word recognition. So that includes decoding, it includes sight words, and as we'll see when we make this a little more complex and nuanced, it includes some other things. And then we have this, idea of language comprehension. If you have enough oral language and others, then if we put these things together, we're going to get skilled reading. This whole idea of Scarborough's rope, which you are probably familiar with if you're joining us today. If not, no worries. This is still a simple view of reading, but it's more nuanced, right? It's digging into, well, what does word recognition really mean? What do language comprehension really mean? So the language comprehension piece, as you can see, gets into background knowledge, vocabulary knowledge, the structures of language. In this case, typically we're talking about English, right? But also your verbal reasoning and your literacy knowledge. And as those threads come together, you can become increasingly strategic about how you use those areas, how you use them together and apart, right? Word recognition includes understanding the phonics of the language, in this case, again, English. Decoding and spelling would be orthographic, how does English work orthographically? And then sight recognition, those sight words. And as you do this more and more, you end up doing it more automatically, and all this becomes skilled reading. However, word recognition and language comprehension are not the only causes when a student is experiencing reading difficulty. There's a considerable overlap between the processes that make word recognition and language comprehension possible when reading. So this is coming from Dr. Nell Duke, who is from our very own U of M, who is a reading specialist and researcher. I really like this active view of reading. So again, we're taking the word recognition and the language comprehension piece from like Scarborough's rope and all of that. And then you're looking at those overlap with those bridging processes, right? And they're adding another element talking about active self-regulation. That's that metacognitive piece too. Knowing what you know, knowing what you don't know, knowing when to try a strategy, and working all of that out. And it plays a very important role when you're reading, and the absence of it, can contribute as well, of course, to difficulties reading. So, and I'm going to be finished with theory in just a moment, I promise. I know this is a lot of buildup. But finally, I want to kind of give you, and this is on the Padlet as well, this effective literacy model for multilingual learners. And this is coming from that National Committee for Effective Literacy, right? That really looks at multilingual learners and all of this. I'm showing you all of this, though this is kind of going K to 12, and it's also showing you dual language programs because I just want you to see their whole schemata here. So of course, we're looking at early childhood, certain things. Then we have essential elements for literacy instruction, and it says K plus because this could be at any time, right? And we have foundational skills, of course, and we have essential literacy components. Which can be for everyone, but again, particular awareness for multilingual learners. Again, you see that oral language development piece. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about these cross-language connections. Writing is there and very important, though we are not going to enter in that topic so much today. But when I think of literacy, I know that the focus often goes to reading, but writing, of course, is a huge part of that. And, the whole English language development piece, how English works, right? And then we have context for this. Again, really looking at where home languages are involved and valued, right? They are particularly mentioned in the areas of print access and active engagement with text, in creating a language and content-rich environment, and using high quality and culturally inclusive materials. Finally, dual language is on there because we would love our goal to always be bilingualism and biliteracy. Not always possible, depending on the populations we serve. To have a dual language program, you need a target language that has a large number of speakers, and that doesn't work if you have, schools with like 20 languages spoken in them. But it's there because it's a beautiful thing when you can do it. So again, just to kind of sum that up, these considerations that we're going to look for our multilingual students, again, are going to be these aspects: oral language development, and talk to you a little bit about translanguaging or using home languages in the classroom, the building background knowledge piece, cross-language connections, foundational skills and what that might look like for multilingual learners, and text sets, both layering multimodal text for student comprehension and also how to adapt some texts. So looking at that oral language development piece first. So there is a book you may or may not be familiar with. It's actually a series from something called Shifting the Balance. And I've, taken this chart from them because it's really nice because it talks about different routines around things. In this case, oral language development and how it involves literacy. And it gives you, a nice why, and it gives you some good examples. So, we would agree with all these things probably, right? We're going to make space for some planned student interactions or conversation, right? We're going to ask quality questions and we're going to provide wait time. So they have a nice thing there, explaining why for all those points. And they even have some great sentence stems about it or teacher moves, right? Different kinds of questions you can have. What I've done when I've delved into this is here I've kind of dropped the why. You can see that if you look on the other slide. But I've got the routine still and the how or their examples and trying to add some scaffolds for multilingual learners. So if we're going to have these interactions and these conversations, those are vital for everyone. And for your multilingual learners to be able to participate, we want to do something called having structured conversations. For example, one of those examples is a QSSSA. I will show you that in just a moment. Again, resources for that are also on the Padlet. But these are involve having sentence stems, which you can see in the next box, to provide multilingual learners with access to these structured conversations and to be able to talk about these things. Providing wait time is absolutely vital. And a lot of working around that is having some way for students to signal you when they're ready to talk with their partners or to talk as a whole class and other things like that. Providing time for peer rehearsal becomes part of that wait time, but it also becomes part of that structured conversation, right? Almost every student can respond whole class later if they've had this time to practice with a partner or a small group in these interactions. I would like to show you another thing around oral language development. So again, this happens to be in their K2 book, and I am pushing for that to go all the way up through grade 12. When you're talking about multilingual learners. We're talking here about the what or the routine, repeating and expanding. So it's kind of summarizing what kids are saying and expanding on their language. Or asking them to do so by saying, tell me more about. And I want you to look at a couple examples about what that can look like for multilingual learners. So this is coming from a science teacher who does it a lot. This strategy is called recast, expand, and repeat. And what this particular science teacher likes is to take the common or sort of tier, one language that we sometimes say, those kind of words. And if a student is saying, it goes around and around. Well, first, when you're describing whatever scientific phenomenon that they're observing, that's absolutely okay because you want them, to delve into what their observations are and be able to record those and speak about those. So what this particular teacher does is he says, well, Simon says goes round and round, and now we're going to talk about the scientific word for that. So a scientist says that it cycles, right? So you can see the conversation there on the right. Oh, so the air cycles through the system and has the student repeat it, right? And they also are doing it with gestures. So show me a quick movement. Sometimes they have the students create those. Sometimes the teacher does. Sometimes the class might do it as a whole to help remember the vocabulary. So all that is very good, and it's a way to expand the language of multilingual learners. Here's another example from the same teacher. Now, in this particular science observation of phenomena, they were using these tools that you see there to represent different bird beaks, and they were using those other materials you see there, like the toothpicks and the gummies and all that, to represent the different kinds of food. So this student is clearly not a newcomer, but even so, when they start, the teacher says, how did the structure of the beak affect the food it collected? And they said, it got more. Now, right there, if you look at that conversation, that student has got it. They have understood, right? But the teacher helps them get more explicit, right? Which beak type, right? So now we have the tweezers for the long beak got more. Um, Quantity and variety, I'm sorry, I should have said as an aside, those were words they had already learned and were on anchor charts in that. So now we're going to put these together. So as you go through that conversation, not only is the student deepening their linguistic knowledge, right, and getting better at that, they're also deepening their content knowledge because they're better able to express what happened, even though with it got more, they had the idea, right? But look how much deeper it gets as they go through that conversation, both linguistically and with regard to the content. So QSSA, as promised, this is the teacher asking an open-ended question and giving the students a moment, some time to think about how they're going to complete a sentence stem. So sentence stem is there in 3, but you have the stem, and sometimes these are differentiated stems. And when the student's ready to respond, they give a signal. So they might have a hand up and you tell them to bring their hand down when they're ready to talk to their partner, or they might have a card on a desk that they flip over to another color. There can be all sorts of ways to do this. After that, then they get, again, that chance for peer rehearsal where they can share with a partner or a small group. And that randomly assesses is like for your own instructional purposes, right? To inform your instruction. Then if students have a chance to practice, the idea is any one of them can answer. Now, of course, you can check in with students and you know your students and who might feel more nervous or who might need a little more support. And you can do that with certain students before calling on them, of course. I'm just going to show you this quick one. This happens to be math, but I think it's worth watching.
But the relationship is proportional.
So QSSA is a way of providing a structured conversation for your students and where you question, signal, stem, share, and then assess. The question is just based on what you're teaching that day.
What makes this relationship proportional?
Whenever you think that you know the answer to this question, I want you to put your hand on your head.
I think the signal helps a lot just because that just gives them that extra time to really be thoughtful and not just wait for somebody else to raise their hand and give them the answer.
This relationship is proportional because, and then you're gonna fill it in.
You provide a stem so that they can respond in a complete sentence and use the academic vocabulary.
This relationship is proportional because it goes to an item.
This relationship is proportional because it has a constant of 28.
QSSA helps with interactions just by providing structure. Those interactions help if they don't know the answer, their partner may, and so their partner can help them foster some new content and language.
The table is proportional because it's in y equals x form. And if it's labels, we could also use the labels.
Yes.
Okay. And then after the sharing process, you just need to assess.
Christian, can you fill in this sentence stem for me, please?
This relationship is proportional because it goes through the origin and it goes through 0, 0.
I think for English learners, this is really valuable because each step really gets them ready to speak. To help my ELs, I make sure I pair them with someone who can help them gain their language. So I'm not gonna put a beginner with a beginner. I just wanna make sure that they know what to do and then they're really practicing those sentence stems. For my English learners, I have lots of anchor charts and I always try to refer to one specific so they're not searching. My students really like QSSA. They are able to learn from one another and they build a lot of confidence whenever they're using it because they're using that academic vocabulary. Just having conversation with others, they like that, but they're also learning from those conversations.
Here's another example where you might have a QSSA. This one has visuals. Just take a look at that and see how much that can support students by labeling this whole process, of cementation. Even down to where the salt crystals are behaving like glue and causing this to kind of happen and come together and stick together. If we were in person, I would be asking you to do this and I would lead you through it. But for today, I just wanted to show you another example of what this can look like. And how does this all relate again back to reading? Well, we're talking about this oral language development and also building background here with vocabulary that we'll see a little more about later as well. But if we go to that whole emergent literacy thing, that if you say it, you can write it. If you write it, you can read it. Again, I'm stressing this not only for students who are at the emergent literacy level, but all the way through school. Here are some sentence stems, and there's a bunch more on the Padlet that you can use for math talk, for reading, for science. These are some differentiated ones. And again, the students can choose the ones that best serve them. So you might have someone just saying, I noticed all the orbits were, while someone else is saying, in each orbit I observed, da 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 da, right? So as they acquire more English, they can use more complicated stems because they'll have a better grasp of syntax and vocabulary in the English language. So looking at our next point about translanguaging or using home languages in the classroom. So translanguaging is not translation. It's again being able to use your full linguistic repertoire, meaning you are using very complex practices within and across and among all of your languages. It also, by allowing it or encouraging it, I would prefer to say, is allowing you to lift the voices of marginalized groups, right? Because they are allowed to use their full linguistic repertoire and use all of their languages to make meaning. So what might we make multilingual? I want you to imagine if someone walks in your school and sees a bunch of languages, how welcome that would make the student and their families, right? So there are some examples here for both classroom and also for your school building, whether that be the office or other common areas. And then what we want to do is think about, again, when we're talking about diverse and culturally responsive text, what does that look like? All right. First, just creating a reading and writing landscape that's multilingual in your room via labeled photographs, via children's writing in all their languages. What message are we sending if we are having students write in different languages, but the languages that make it to the bulletin board is when they've written something completely in English? So again, of course, we want them to acquire English. Of course, we want them to be literate in English, but we don't want to just act like English is the only language of literacy, right? We want to show that we value languages by having them in some of the classroom texts that we have, whether they're bilingual texts or texts that use translanguaging themselves, or whether that comes across in the children's writing as well. Anchor charts can be bilingual, and you can have family and student input on how that works. This is an example from an advanced placement environmental science class, and I'm just bringing it up again because of that message that we're sending. So, what does it mean if I'm allowed to use, Spanish or Arabic when I'm taking Algebra 1, but if I've made it to calculus, we no longer do any of that in any language except for English, right? What are we saying about the value of someone's home language that way? So this was a monolingual English speaking teacher who had a lot of translanguaging happening in her AP classroom. And these are just a couple of examples. And this is some of the student response to her doing that. And I love all of these quotes, but one of the ones I really like is that if you look at that last one where the student says, I felt like I learned the information well because I was able to explain it in both languages I speak. How often do we ask students, well, paraphrase that for me, tell me that in your own words, right? To show that they've really internalized something. If you are using another language to do that, you are absolutely using your own words to talk about it. So another area that we brought up earlier was building background knowledge. Here are some strategies for explicit vocabulary instruction that really all students need, but is absolutely essential for multilingual learners. And we're going to look at some of these things and also see how it might vary a little bit. But even if multilingual learners need a little bit of something else, I bet you can think of other students who are monolingual English speakers who would also benefit from that strategy. So one of the strategies on there were different kinds of word walls. So here, not only adding, students' native languages, we also are adding sentences. We're adding visuals. What could that possibly look like, right? And of course, this is also getting back a little bit to the translanguaging piece as well. If you're doing things like Freyer models, again, the amount of visuals here, the amount of other languages used, using some you can really put in any, I like to call it four corner really, because a traditional Freyer model is great, but sometimes you might want to put something else in the corner than what is on the traditional model, right? Of the examples and non-examples and definition and characteristics, right? What I like about some of these is if you look at the investigation one, that's going back to science, and right now, with the NGSS standards for science, we don't want to give away maybe what's going to happen with the phenomenon that we're observing for a particular unit. But there are certain words, right, like investigate, like cause effect, like all these other things that might happen that can go within and across units. And those are the kind of things that are perfect for these type of anchor charts as well. So if we look at this is again coming from that NCAEL document on multilingual learners and literacy. We have the vocabulary development and background knowledge piece here. So what do we want to see? Well, some of the things would be things that you may have already learned in other literacy classes, right? Like explicit vocabulary teaching. That is something that we want to look for multilingual learners as well as everybody else. They are adding here, though I would argue that again, these are good for all learners, they're kind of having the visuals, realia, and manipulatives that are providing context for this language and literacy. And of course, home language resources again. So we're going to see that appear again and again. So that's because students will be able to make meaning if they are allowed to use their full linguistic repertoire. And I would go to that first point again of thematic instruction. And we'll see that when we look at text sets a little later as well. Like how many things can we put together that can really allow multiple entry points into the text that we're going to read. And then again, if you're even looking at those comprehension and meaning making skills at the bottom, all of this, teaching comprehension skills or whatever, sometimes they get called thinking moves, whatever you're doing, right? Or if students are working on an exercise and they're doing reciprocal teaching, the whole summarizing, predicting, and questioning piece, what readers do, modeling that and giving students opportunities to use those, right? But what might look different are the type of scaffolds that multilingual learners need to participate, such as those sentence stems, such as those visuals. In addition, we hope that whoever the ELD or ESL teacher is for these students, that they are also focusing on these different kinds of structural and textual features of English with the students when they work with them as well. And I'm going to highlight before going on that whole MLs or multilingual learners can decode words but not tell you what they mean. That is very common. And again, if we're going back to that whole idea that if a monolingual English student decodes a word and then they know what the thing is or what the sentence says, they're very excited, right? And the multilingual learner may or may not learn that this is just something we do, but they might not have connected it in the end that we're making meaning by doing this. If the words they're decoding don't have meaning for them because they're not sure what they mean. Again, coming back from that Shifting the Balance book, one of the strategies they talk a lot to build background knowledge are teacher read alouds, right? And again, they're giving some examples of how to carry it out. And then from the NCEL literacy model, I would pull out then again, same strategy, right? Teachers reading aloud complex expressive literature and writing, right? And then adding scaffolding the engagement with such text. So how are the students going to be answering the questions that the Shifting the Balance authors wrote in the how? What kind of sentence stems? What kind of peer rehearsal? What kind of ways can you have multilingual learners and other learners generate these kind of discussions and writing based on these discussions. Something that appears more for multilingual learners than anyone are cross-language connections. We'll see what that looks like. So again, it's getting to know your students' languages and why things might be happening, first of all. So if we look at the morpheme S, which in English can be plural, it can be possessive, or it becomes the third person singular S, like he takes the bus to school, right? So if someone isn't doing the S or things aren't coming out right, it's kind of finding out something about their language to know about why, right? So if you have a student whose home language is French, they will see S's and ES's on the ends of words. And they might be completely great readers in French, but we don't pronounce those typically, right? So then it's note to self. If I'm doing a running record, I am not going to take off points because the kid is saying horse instead of horses when it comes up. But note to self, I need to teach that student to do that in English, right? Because we do pronounce it. But we don't have a significant error there, right? It might be that your student speaks Chinese or Mandarin, and there is no morpheme to represent plural words. So they would say the equivalent of two book. And in fact, I had a Mandarin speaker once say to me, people think that the Chinese are primitive because they'll say two book, right, instead of two books. And they'll say they don't sound good. I said, but we think you're primitive because I just told you there are two. Why do you need an S at the end to know that there's more than one? So I took some joy in that description. On the Padlet, you're going to find that we have these language transfer resources from a few different places. So these are charts that will tell you some language structure things, some language transfer, some phonics. Of course, not every language is covered, and even the ones that are don't have every single thing. But you can kind of see, is maybe this happening because the student doesn't have that sound in their home language, or they don't have that grammatical structure. Or their word order is different, or their syntax is different for whatever reason. So these can be really helpful tools to see. And again, it becomes note to self on how to stress how this works in the English language then when you're reading and writing with students. Here is a very detailed example of this. This is again, we have the cross-language connections, we have some translanguaging going on. These are the first graders, and none of them were literate in English, Russian, or Japanese yet. They were learning to read in English at the time. But the teacher was able to go and color code these words in Russian and the characters in Japanese so that they could do this cross-language comparison, right? This teacher, by the way, did not know Russian or Japanese, but based on what she saw and was able to translate see that the adjectives came before each word. And so these students working in this group, that they could see that these describing words or adjectives come before the noun for all these languages. Now, had she had a Spanish or a French speaker, they just would have been comparing and saying that, they come afterwards. So all of the students got very, excited to compare their different languages. And again, this is even the fact that they were not reading, in Russian or in the Cyrillic alphabet at that time, but they loved making the connections between it. Here is some secondary ones. So this particular teacher had students analyze each sentence, what seems similar across the two languages, was anything different? Looking at the simple sentences and talking about how there's a subject and a predicate, just one each, in those simple sentences for both Spanish and English, right? And then they started to talk about that writers who want to express more complicated ideas are going to include more than one subject or more than one predicate, right? And one of the ways they do that is by embedding a clause in the sentence. So then they started working on those embedded clauses, and they were looking to see what additional information was there and how it was expressed in each language. And in this particular comparison, again, it ended up being a similarity because, the clause about the father, was coming in between the commas in both languages. So let's take a moment to look at those foundational skills. So again, this is coming from the NCEL document, but what are we looking for, right? So phonemic awareness, that is knowing and hearing the sounds in a word, right? And being able to separate that out, or sometimes blend it together as well. But looking for multilingual learners, what works or what is similar in both languages? So for all students, we're going to be looking for rhymes and repetitive phrases and play with the sounds of words. Again, we're going to segment them, we're going to blend them together, we're going to clap out syllables, all those kind of fun things. But again, if we can learn something about the child's language and be able to focus on that, or begin by focusing on sounds that are similar before we get into the ones that are different, right? When I taught kindergarten way back in the day, I did try in this bilingual program to have words that would start with the same initial consonant sound. Not always possible, but if I could, I would. And we'll see a couple examples of that later on another chart on what that could look like. But just to help, that we were already playing with our names and moving around initial consonants and consonant sounds anyway. But to be able to say, instead of having like, book and libro be an L and a B, trying to find things, pizza is dropping into my mind now. I did have all my students eventually tell me pizza is the same in any language. So that became kind of a running joke and things that we would end on. But if you do have something like that, then you can be looking at sounds that are similar is a good entry point. Concepts of print, again, sometimes they're the same, sometimes they're different. Arabic reads right to left, right? What kind of alphabet do you use? English uses the Latin alphabet, as do Spanish and French and German and a lot of other languages. A lot of languages don't, right? So we have all different kinds of script and ways to go. So doing this through modeling and also collaborative shared writing about experiences, can be very powerful for this. But again, going back to the beginning where we had students who maybe come in who are literate in their home languages, it's just learning how English works then. Oh, in English we go left to right. Okay. That doesn't mean you'll totally have it. You might have to turn your book around a couple times, but it's just basically learning, okay, I do it this way in Arabic, but we do it this way in English, and then it won't cause a problem. But it's just, do we already have concepts of print at all? Or do we just have to know what the concepts of print are like in English? Onto phonics decoding and fluency, the same thing here. I just think with phonics, again, it's going to depend on the age of the student. It's going to depend on how literate they are in their home language. So is this just something that they've got to learn to be able to transfer over? Or is this something that we're starting with, right? And we're going back to phonemic awareness and, phonics and decoding and really having specific skills taught there too. So we really want to see small groups in general for that, unless you happen to have a large group of students who have the same issues, right? And we do want to be paying attention across languages, like this is how this is said. I'm going to give you an example of that over here. So this gives you kind of a phonics skill projection, and as you can see, it's usually how things are taught, right? We start with the letter sounds, and then we usually end up with short vowel words. There's a reason for this. It's actually sort of ingrained in our brains. This is kind of the logical progression. And so in that sense, it's also going to be a logical progression for students who have home languages other than English. However, and again, this tends to happen with the students who are more literate in their home languages. What you may find is you may have to circle back or spend more time or something, or, depending on what the similarities or differences are. So as an example, if your language does not say I for the AI, E and I, and I mean basically not say it at all, not that it belongs to another letter, that's going to cause some problems, because even phonemic awareness, are they going to really be hearing those sounds, right? Bat, bit, bet. Are they hearing those short vowel sounds there enough to distinguish them, right? Whereas the long vowels, even though it might be another letter, I'm going to give a Spanish example again. So English E says A for them, right? English I says E for them, but they have the sounds. So it might be getting used to, okay, so I know which English letter has to say it. Or when there's a silent E, this is what happens. But that part actually might go more quickly for them, and they might have to keep going back and reviewing some of the short vowel sounds that don't exist in their language. Here's another example of foundational skills, but bringing translanguaging back in. This can be great. It's just kind of a formative assessment piece. She writes Larrybug there, but that really, Larry, that's what she's hearing for ladybug, and really, it's really, really close. So for instance, this is a student I would not be worried about at all, needs more time to keep acquiring English and adjusting to some sounds there. Um, the word water was taken from their anchor chart. So she basically said, my bug needs water, so I fui a mi casa y le traje. The Spanish is almost perfect. The E should be like a Y, but just, speaking of phonics, it's absolutely perfect. So again, this is not someone that I would have any fear for whatsoever or think needs any additional reading support, just to continue on and learning more about the different sounds in English and how those work, as well as acquiring more English vocabulary. Here's some of those cross-language connections now, coming back into this too with the foundational skills. So some things are very close, like temperatura and temperature, thermometro, thermometer. Don't start with the same sound, same letter though. So there are some different things that could happen, like noche and night, sol and sun, dia and day. So these are things that kids can look at and color code with you and combine. So getting into text sets now. So this one is secondary. This is, though obviously for elementary school, we can use these as well. There are links on this slide deck and on the Padlet around this if you are interested in looking into more about this. One thing I have neglected to say is all of these things on all of these slides can also be found in the Mesa Geln essential literacy standards there. So one of the things for secondary is essential 2 is diverse text and abundant reading opportunities, and that's where these text sets fit in. And we're talking here about having sets. So if you have something like To Kill a Mockingbird, how are we providing students with access to that? And that can be for just many different reasons. But of course, my focus here is multilingual learners, right? But we want to have, if that's our target text, what are we doing to give students access to that text? Dr. Goldie Muhammad also talks about the value of layering texts. She says that I argue that when teachers layer multiple, short, powerful, multimodal texts as they teach, students have a better chance at academic and personal success. There's also a link to learning science via text sets that you can look at. So this is coming now from the multilingual side, and this is one example. There's this great Project Learn, where you can find lots of examples of teachers doing different things with translanguaging. So the target text for this particular lesson were that contemporary political cartoon that you see and the Monroe Doctrine, which is right there on the left. So what did the teacher do? They had videos, right, showing some mass incarceration and what's going on in El Salvador. This is actually before last spring. Anyway, save that for another time. There was also a parody video on the Monroe Doctrine, set to the tune of Beat It by Michael Jackson. They had some different maps to look at as entry points too. And then they also had a 2-paragraph summary that came off of history.com and Spanish and Arabic translations of that. So all of these things in order to get in to comprehending those target texts that you see there on the left. When you are getting text sets together, and I would use the exact same words when I go into elementary and talk about ways to analyze and interrogate your classroom library. But again, looking at anything you're reading aloud or asking them to read, how are the different characters depicted? And are your students represented? And not just are they represented, but how are they represented? Are they represented in complex ways or simplistic ways, right? Because what we want is we want students and their families represented in complex ways. We'd also like to see some translanguaging going on in some of these books. Here is an example of that at a middle school. And this class got into, first of all, noticing, right, looking at the excerpt, doing the quotes, and what are the observations. Do we need to italicize words that come from another language? There's big debate about that these days, and this class was able to have that. And then also extending that to when I write, how might I use translanguaging in my writing? Finally, adapting text a little more. This is called engineered text. And what this is adding different things to provide scaffolds and entry points into the text. So let me give you a couple examples of that. So here is one, was about a suspension bridge. So first they chunked it and actually labeled this little piece of suspension bridge. And as you can see, they're putting synonyms in English into the text itself. So if we're saying here that the design is extremely effective, we're saying that it works well and putting that right in there. Just like to point out that sometimes the most common word in your student's language might look like the more academic word in English. So where it says this is held in place by vertical suspenders, vertical is really the word that would be very common in Spanish. So that top to bottom might support some students or it might not be needed. But again, it isn't bothering anyone who does not need it, but it is providing support for those who do. Here is another example. And I would like to say these additions, in red are mine. If you look down there when it's talking about the nadir view, that's what was already provided in the text. So I think that content area teachers are really good at providing definitions and access to those tier 3 words, those words that are very specific to their unit or to their discipline, but they might not think about those tier 2 words that are academic language that can be used across disciplines, like suitable image, right? Suitable image is a good image, right, that we need, or surface features, giving examples of what those might be. Now, the reason that few says 2 to 10 is that would not be my typical definition of it. However, in the particular assignment that these students had, they were asked to give 2 to 10 different types of surface features. So that's why that's there. And finally then, we have a lot of resources on the Padlet. Again, these literacy essentials all the way through 12th grade from MESA really tie in with this very well. And you have resources on the slide and in the Padlet. The Literacy Learning Network from Wayne County also links to those science text sets and some other great videos and strategies as well. We have a disciplinary literacy resources hub, again, linking to MESA literacy essentials and other types of resources. And finally, we have our Literacy and Multilingual Learners Resource Padlet, which is connected as well and has the resources that are in this deck and some other ones as well. So that was a lot. I know it's a lot of information. If there are any questions before we go, I'd be happy to take them. Otherwise, I'm going to wish you a happy weekend.